I was engaged to my high school sweetheart, who I pretty much allowed to treat me like dirt. After high school, while we were living together, it was apparent that the relationship wasn't going anywhere, and I finally had the courage to end it. I was the one with the job and the money, so I was keeping the apartment and asked her to move out. I think I gave her about 2 weeks or something. Eventually, she shacked up with some guy and was out of my hair. Every now and then, she would pop in because she left all of her shit at my place while she was trying to find her new place. I kept hearing stories from everyone of her epic levels of sluttiness and just tried to stay away from it all as best I could. At some point though, out of anger, I went into her jewellery box and took the engagement ring that I had given her. It was several weeks before she realised it was gone, at which point I'd already sold it, and when she confronted me about it, I told her. She lost her shit. She started demanding that I give it back to her, or at least its value in cash. I told her that's not how engagement rings work, and that she can go screw herself. She started hitting me and trashing my place. I didn't have to take it. She was smaller than I was, and I was a black belt, and I just let her take her anger out. She ripped my shirt, slapped me, punched me, kicked me, everything. Finally, she hit me square in the face and drove my head into the door behind me. On the other side of the door was a calendar hanging on a nail that struck through the door just a small amount, but enough to drive it to the back of my skull, and it really hurt. I just grabbed her hands to stop her from flailing about anymore and directed her over to the door. She could tell that I had lost my patience, so she just stormed out. About an hour after, she shows up with her mother and the police. The cops took my statement, took one look at me and asked if I wanted to press charges or if I needed an ambulance. I declined both, and then he escorted her and the mother off the property and advised that they take it up with a small claims court if they wanted to proceed any further. But it was more hassle than it was worth, and she didn't really break anything, just made a mess, and I had a cut on the back of my head, which looked worse than it was since it was bleeding pretty good. I just wanted her gone at that point. I was on a long road trip with a friend about 2 years ago, when we finally stopped in an incredibly remote area. It was a huge forested area on the coast, with a military base tucked away somewhere in there. My friend and I decided to go for a hike at about 9 PM. It might seem like a stupid idea, but the area wasn't exactly mountainous. It was a pretty bright night, and we were well geared, so if we got lost, we could have easily waited out the night. We sort of forgot that it was Halloween until we were halfway through the hike, talking about how big the moon was. A 20-minute walk away from the empty car park, and approximately 20 to 30 minutes drive to civilization. As we walked, we could hear thumping, but we disregarded it as kangaroos. It was scary at first to hear something that big go racing past in a dark blur, but it happened so often, we eventually got used to it. When we neared the coast, we could hear the waves rolling in. We searched around for a way down to the beach, when suddenly we heard something different. There was a steep descent on one side of the path, and we could hear something big climbing up from the water. Branches were snapping, and you could hear very heavy breaths as it got further and further up. My friend turned to leave when we heard a man's voice shakily say, "Hello?" My friend looked at me and shook his head and backed away silently. I instinctively, curiously said, "Hello?" and called back, "Is this the path?" Holy shit. Someone had fallen off the path on the way to the beach. "Yeah, we'll pull you up." And using a broken branch, we pulled him up the path. He stood up, thanked us and said, "Have you seen my friend?" No." "Oh, I'm sure he'll be around. Thanks, guys." And with that he walked off. He went to the beach, skipped some stones, and on the way back, we saw him again standing in the path with another man. They were just standing there talking quietly. We passed, said good day, and received a mumbled reply and walked by. When we got to our cars, there was a 4WD parked not far away. There's no way that we could have missed that. It was right in front of our headlights. Where did he come from? And how did we pass his friend? How did they get split up? Who knows? When I was in grade school, my family lived in a house that sat directly across from the school I attended. However, there was about half a mile of wooded area between them. I was allowed to walk to and from school because it was so straightforward. My mother informed me that she and her siblings walked through the woods to school when they were younger, so it felt like a natural and safe thing for her. I loved the excitement of being able to walk to school all on my own, and I felt pretty at home in the woods, as I had been raised around them. The walk was pretty direct, and with very little issues, aside from the small but wide creek that I had to cross. The creek itself was no problem. It was the fact that on each side there was a steep bank that had to be scaled. It wasn't too terrible unless it had been raining. It had rained the day before, so my steps, which were normally loud, were fairly silent. This might have saved my life. It at least saved me from something terrible. When I reached the creek, I was in my own little world. I was thinking about a science project we had to do at school, and whether or not I was fully prepared for my part in it. I was doing the supernova section, and wasn't feeling very ready to make a speech in front of everyone explaining it. Anyway, I reached the creek and dropped down the first bank with a slightly wet thud. I crossed over the water and began looking for something to grab hold of to pull myself up with. There were usually roots sticking out for you to use. Before I could climb up onto the other side though, I heard a noise, like people talking. I stopped and waited to see if I could hear it again, and I did. I heard a couple of boys talking, getting closer to me. I smashed myself up against the bank and listened for a minute. I don't know why, but something just told me to stay away, that something was wrong. The boys came so close, all the way to the edge of the creek bank, but they didn't jump down. If they had, they would have seen me in a flash. As luck would have it, there was an overhang that I was able to hide under, and I listened as the boys spoke. "Yeah, she comes through here all the time. She should be coming around any minute now." My heart sank. I was the only person that walked this trail to and from school, and they were in my direct path. That wasn't to say that no one else was ever in the woods, but in all the time I used this trail, I'd never seen anyone else. To get to the woods from my house, I had to cross the road and walk through a small flat area with no trees. And from the school side, I had to walk through the school's football field. Anyone from either side could have seen me going in or out of the woods easily. I stood, plastered to the wall of mud, waiting for them to catch me. But they walked around a little bit, smoked a few cigarettes, and started getting frustrated. "Where the hell is she, man? You said she'd be here, so why isn't she?" "Maybe she isn't coming to school today." "Anyway, we gotta go, we're gonna miss our bus." The high schoolers caught their bus to the high school at the elementary school. This told me two things. One, they were obviously in high school, so much older than me. And two, they had some seriously bad intentions towards me. I heard them leave, but I didn't dare move. I waited a good 30 minutes or so before I darted out of the creek and towards home. I will never know exactly what those boys had planned to do to me, and I'm not sure I want to. I was a cop for a few years in the Miami metro area, in my early 20s. About a month after completing my field training program, I got dispatched to an industrial silent alarm call in a pretty rough neighborhood. Alarm calls were pretty routine, but always kept us on our toes, as the suspect could range from faulty wiring to a 6'5" naked dude on PCP, trying to pry some copper. I'm on scene within a couple of minutes of getting the call. Lo and behold, my old field training officer, a sergeant, and her new trainee pull up. By this time, the alarm company had notified the owner, who provided dispatch with a code to enter the side door with an electric keypad. My sergeant had the rookie watch the front of the warehouse, while me and her made entry through that side door. We have our guns and lights out and start sweeping up and down the aisles, which were about 25 feet high and filled with old electronics and furniture, mostly. We can't find any light switches, so we continue sweeping with our lights. Just as we had almost finished clearing out the warehouse, we heard very fast footsteps from the opposite direction. We start jogging our way there, yelling out that police were there and to come out. We come to where we thought we heard the footsteps, when my sergeant suddenly spun around. She later said she saw a flash in her peripheral vision and ducked around to the other side of the warehouse shelf. No one was there. We started creeping back out towards where we came from to wait for K9 when we heard a high-pitched giggle from right behind us. Imagine the most stereotypical little girl in a horror movie giggling. We spin around and we both light up a 4-foot little girl with hair down to her butt, sprinting down the aisle in the opposite way. She had to have appeared out of thin air, because we were both scared and shit our pants at this point, and our senses were at 110%, and we completely missed her. We naturally holstered our guns and gave chase. Here's the thing, neither of us could catch her. My sergeant wasn't particularly fast, and I wasn't a track star, but both of us were surely capable of catching a small child. Nope. We turn a corner, and she'd be 10 feet further up the aisle than where she was before when she turned the corner. And within 20 seconds, we lost her completely. At that point, we went outside and waited for more units to turn up. The property owner gets there along with 5 other units and a K9, and we re-enter. The owner turns on the lights, and we search the entire place from top to bottom. Nothing is stolen, and the girl cannot be found anywhere. Again, impossible. All the entries were both locked from the inside and padlocked on the outside, and we had officers covering the entire exterior. There's no possible way that a child could have been in there without us finding her. My sergeant was extremely Catholic, and swears up and down that it was either a demon or a lost spirit. I think I might have to agree. This starts off very cheesy, but it is all true. One dark and very stormy night at the hospital, I was working with a new CNA and training her on how things run around the hospital. Basically, she needed to know how to help me, the nurse, and how I did things. Well, we start to walk down one hallway, and we both are paralyzed in fear, because we see a dark, malevolent looking figure at the end of the hall by the exit sign. I take off running, and she follows. We scream and talk about what we saw, and she swears she saw a fog around the entity. In the end, we chalk it up to late night shifts and too much coffee, and laughter ensues. Well, even though it's night time, no one sleeps in a hospital, so we are paged to go to a room and continue our rounds. We carefully look down the hallway and see nothing is there. We do our work with a patient, and as soon as we step out of the room, there is the scary shadow man at the end of the hall. We scream and take off running. I called security, and they come up to check everything, and of course nothing can be found. But then we hear an alarm start to go off in a room, so we bolt in there. It's the room at the end of the hall where the figure was. A doctor and another nurse had made it there before us, and the patient had died. Now, this was a stroke patient who was paralyzed and could not walk. The weird part was her window was open, so the CNA and I started crying and explaining what had been happening. The doctor requested security play back the video of the hallway to make sure no one hurt the patient. In the video, we could all clearly see a dark shadow that never disappeared. And yes, it did look like it was surrounded by fog. Right before the patient alarm went off, the shadow vanished. Now everyone claims this was the angel of death. I don't know what it was, but I'm glad that I don't work there anymore. So I am a male nurse at a large hospital in San Francisco. I work in the ER, and as is custom Thanksgiving night, it was very busy. Now my wife is also a nurse for the same hospital, but she works in labor and delivery. Between babies being born left and right, and people coming into the ER, we hadn't had a chance to take our break together, as we try to do it every shift. So when she called, I figured it was to say that she wanted to meet up for a bite to eat in the cafeteria. When I answered, I heard in the background a male voice screaming profanities, and my wife, who is fluent in Spanish, trying to calm him down. She told me their pager wasn't working, and that they needed security's stat. I quickly hung up, called security and told my fellow nurses what was going on, and ran for labor and delivery, worried sick about my wife. When I almost ran, smack dab into this visibly angry man. He wasn't huge, but bro, he definitely worked out. Not at the gym, and he was covered in prison tattoos, and he was obviously a banger. I worked out regularly, but I knew this guy could kick my ass. He looked at me, gave me this sick grin, and started heading towards me, sprouting off in Spanish. My Spanish isn't all that great, but from what I understood, he scared the living shit out of me. I backed up as fast as I could and started buzzing the door to the ER frantically in order for them to let me in. This guy is literally a foot away from me as the door opens, and I'm pulled into the safety by a doctor. The gangbuster punches the door a few times and makes a dragging sign across his throat while grinning at both of us. Next thing I know, the police rush into the corridor and he's taken away by 2 security officers and 2 cops. I finally make it to my wife, who thankfully was shaken up but unhurt. She explained to me what happened. A young girl of only 14 came in, high fever, vomiting, distended belly. The banger claimed he was her brother and that they needed to cut her open to get her baby. They did an ultrasound, and to their horror, she realized she wasn't pregnant, but she had bags of drugs in her stomach. This is very common for drug mules to bring over young women from Mexico carrying drugs that way. Homeboy freaked out when they informed her his sister needed emergency surgery. And no, he wasn't getting his drugs. Thankfully the girl survived. But they said the thing is, she will most likely be deported once she recovers. So this happened a few years ago. I was about 17 during the summer. My mom, brother and I had a routine going during the summer, so there was always a period of time on weekdays where I would be home alone for a couple of hours before I had to go to work. We had a big house, and I always absolutely hated being home alone. With the big house came a big yard, and we always had someone come every week, as grass grows very quick in the Texas heat, to come and mow it. I never actually saw the people who mowed it, because they would usually come when I was leaving for college class early in the morning. The day this happened was a Tuesday, and I was just relaxing watching TV, dreading the fact that I had to go to work, and my mum and brother hadn't been gone for 5 minutes when I heard a knock on the door. Being the cautious person I was, I decided to part the blinds a little in order to peep out the window next to the door to see who it was. Right when I did, I made eye contact with a dirty-looking man. He gave me a wide smile, walked to the window and said, "Hey, we're here to cut your grass, but you have to move your car because we don't want to damage it." This made sense to me, because despite the big house, we had a not-so-big driveway, and my front left wheel would always be on the grass. So I nod and run to my room and grab my keys. As I grab my keys, I look out the window which faces the driveway to see that the lawnmower guy doesn't have any equipment, just a white pickup and another guy sitting in on the phone. While this might not have unnerved a normal person, it gave me an uneasy feeling. I tried to call my mum as I make my way back down to the living room, but she didn't answer, so I left a voicemail. Then I went into my restroom, looked through the window as it had a view of our front door, and saw the guy trying to look through the living room window and turning back to the other guy in the truck. I walk back to the living room and contemplate my next move. Then I hear a tap on the window. "Hello? We need you to move your car right now. We can't start until you do." I just stand there. "Ma'am, we need you to move your car. We can see you through the blinds. You're just standing there." So, being the badass I am, you can imagine my next awesome move. I make my way back to my room and hide in my closet. I hear them then pounding on the door and window. Their threats ranged from, "If you don't move your car right now, we're leaving and your mum is going to be really mad," to, "You need to come outside now." I just sat there and cried until they left. Probably 5 minutes later, and I stayed there until after they were gone. About an hour later, my dear mother calls and confirms that the lawnmower guys were not coming that day. I hate to think the worst, but a part of me thinks that they'd been watching my family and knew our routine quite well. For about a week after, The same white pickup would park slightly past our house and just sit there. Cops said they couldn't do anything about it. Let me first give you a little background. I am from a small town in Belgium, and there aren't that many strange people around. I'm 21 years old, and was 34 weeks pregnant at the time. Yesterday I went to the market to get a few things. Vegetables, fruit, some flowers and a new scarf, things like that, and was just walking around for a bit. It's not unusual that people will stop me and ask about the baby, when I'm due, if it's a boy or a girl. So when a couple did, I didn't think anything of it. It's a busy market, so it's not like we were alone. I've also heard all these questions a million times before. And let's be honest, it's nice to talk about the baby. It's a pleasant little routine. Things started getting a bit weird after I told them that I was having a boy. The man started talking about how they've been trying for years and years, and how he's always wanted a son. The woman kept inching closer, staring at my belly, moving her hand closer slowly, almost like how you would approach a stray cat. When she notices that I'm watching her, she asks if she can pet him. Even though I'm generally quite a polite person, I say no, and she keeps staring and twitching her hand. The man is almost in tears now, still talking about how his son and everything that he planned out for him, how he'll look, school, soccer training, his first girlfriend, marriage, career. His whole life had been planned out in vivid detail. This is getting too creepy for me, so I bid them good day and start walking away, when the woman grabs my coat, almost begging me to stay, and what she said next made me want to run. You know, you look so young. I just can't believe this really is your choice, and obviously it's too late for an abortion. So maybe we can make this situation positive for everyone. How about we take care of the little guy? We'll be better parents than you'll ever be. We'll pay you. How much do you want? 15? 20 grand? The man is actually grabbing his wallet, as if he's going to take the money out right then and there. I've really had it, and I just say, "Are you insane? No! Leave me alone!" And I get the hell out of there. She shouts after me, "Are you sure you want to keep it?" And while I didn't respond, they let me be. They probably didn't even mean to scare or offend me, but it was still a very creepy encounter. I really hope not to meet the weird potential baby snatchers again, especially not after I have my baby. My entire life, starting from when I was about 7, all the way up to now, has been a let's not meet diary. Today I went shopping for some food and hygiene stuff. I was in the fruit aisle, and I was approached by a bloke that looked similar to a dark-skinned version of Fat Bastard from Austin Powers, if you can bring yourself to imagine that. He introduces himself by saying, "Can I have your number, baby? I want to hit that pussy up." And I responded by showing him my engagement ring and saying that I had a partner and that I wouldn't be interested. I'd been polite to him, despite how he spoke to me. He then says, "Well, he's not here now, so what can he do? As far as I'm concerned, you're alone." At this point, I'm getting sick of it and quite frightened by the prospect of being alone with this man, because the supermarket was quiet. So I sped up and became erratic in my decision about which aisle to go down next. I raced like a lunatic to the tills and went to the male cashier. The creepy guy was nowhere to be seen. I thought he had gotten bored. As I walked to the exit, I saw him out of the corner of my eye and decided to call my partner. He picks up quickly, and I put him on speaker, asking him to put the kettle on because I was nearly home. I did this in hope that the creep would hear his voice and know my partner was home and that I'm near home. It didn't work, so I took plan B. Plan B was simply to run home as quickly as possible, but it wasn't that easy because I had a lot of main roads to cross. I legged it up to the first set of lights, but they were red so I couldn't cross. The cars move at 40 miles per hour on that road, so it would have been stupid to try and J-run. I'm thinking, shit, he's right on me. He was at least 10 feet away from me, and the lights turned green, so I ran and kept running until I saw a side street I was familiar with. I know running down a side street wasn't the best idea, but neither was waiting on the main road for him to catch me up, and then have no doubt where my boyfriend's house is. I can't explain the decision I made because it wasn't logical. It was intuitive. Through reading The Gift of Fear, I've learnt to listen to my intuition and smallest hints and trust them. I was running for 5 minutes straight before I made it home and fell into my partner's arms, before trying to tell him what happened. I'm considering reporting this to the police, just in case this guy tries to shit on more vulnerable young women who might not be as physically able as me. Although I've had a lot of creepy and frightening experiences in my life, this is definitely in my top 10, because of how isolated I could have been, and how different decisions I could have made in going home could have made all the difference in my safety and the outcome of this story. Of all the stories I've ever heard about being in the middle of nowhere, reminds me of something that I used to do back in my youth. Allow me to explain. I used to live in a small village way out in the country, which wasn't a problem, except when I would want to go out to the club at the weekend. I was pretty big into the party scene, and I would end up leaving the club at about 3 AM. The only way back at that time was to take the bus, but the bus's last stop was a couple of towns over, so I would have to stagger back several miles, cutting through woods and fields at 4 AM, which, as many of you can probably imagine, is an absolutely perfect way to end the night. Notice the sarcasm. But anyway, I tried to make the most of it, being so buzzed after the clubbing scene. At a couple of points, my route took me within about 50 meters of sharp turns in small country roads. Cars would occasionally come down the road, and these sharp turns made their headlights sweep across the fields. So I'd be in complete darkness for them, and then suddenly lit up for a couple of seconds before they went around the corner. So I used to find it endlessly funny to stand completely still in the middle of nowhere in that field and stare at them as they went past. There was one occasion that I remember in particular. It was the middle of winter, and I was absolutely wasted. I fell over climbing one of the fences and grabbed the barbed wire to stop myself. No doubt, I managed to impale my hands on the fence pretty badly, and blood was absolutely everywhere, dripping from each finger. It was glorious. So, there I am, in the middle of a field as a car comes by, blood dripping from my hands, standing strong and unnerving the passengers. I couldn't see their reaction, but I'm pretty sure that they shut themselves, given the fact that they almost crashed into the fence, no doubt too busy being petrified by me. I always hoped that somewhere there's someone who tells a story about how they were driving in the middle of nowhere on a desolate road, when out of nowhere they see this maniac standing in the middle of a snowy field in the middle of nowhere at 4 a.m, dripping with blood. When I was in college, I worked at an after-hours emergency clinic. My shift ended at midnight, and since the stores were much less crowded at that hour, I often did grocery shopping then. As a side note, I am female, and was in my early 20s when this happened. I go to the local store one night after work, parking in a great spot, since the lot is almost empty, and head towards the store. As I'm walking towards the lot, I hear a male voice calling, Excuse me, ma'am?" I look to my right and see a man sitting in a blue station wagon, about 5 spaces away from where I had parked. Having my attention now, he says, "I'm sorry to bother you. My wife and I are trying to get home, and we've run out of gas. She's in the store right now, asking people for help. Could you spare a few dollars so that we could get some gas to go home?" Now normally, I don't mind helping out someone who's down on his luck, but something just felt so nope about the situation. I replied that I was sorry, but didn't have any cash. I went into the store to grab the few things I needed, and the whole time I was inside, I just could not shake the uneasy feeling I had. I was completely on edge by the time I made it to the checkout line. After I paid for my items, I started to walk out, but my body just did not want to cooperate. I'd take a few more steps, then I'd stop again. I turned back to the male cashier and said, "I know I'm about to sound really lame, but could you see if someone could walk me out to my car? There was a creepy guy out there earlier and I just didn't feel comfortable." He took some of my bags in his hand so that it wouldn't be so obvious that he was escorting me, and said he'd walk me out since he didn't have any other customers. To exit the store, you have to go through 2 sets of sliding double doors. We walked through the first set, and I stopped cold. The freaking station wagon was now parked next to my car. I told the cashier this, and he told me that he wouldn't let anything happen to me. We walked through the second set of double doors, and started walking towards my car. About this time, the station wagon starts up, and the driver pulls out of the parking spot. It was then that I noticed that there was no wife in the car, but there was another man. I don't know what these guys were planning to do, and I'm glad I never had to find out, thanks to my impromptu bodyguard. I used to spend my summers on my grandfather's commercial fishing boat when he had my brother and I with me in the summer. He'd take us out to jig fish for flounder. My grandfather was an ex-Navy man. He served in World War II and lived a pretty rough life. He moved with a stoop and a slow gait, and I remember thinking he was aging pretty hard for a man in his early 60s. He had a favourite fishing spot that he would take us to, which he referred to as the Bell. It was a big hole in the ocean floor, about an hour northeast of PEI, which went further than his sonar could plumb, and it routinely had great fishing. Jig lines are weird things. They're not regular fishing lines. They're unbaited lines that are covered in a couple of dozen barbed hooks in the last 10 feet. So, you drop the line down into the ocean a couple of 100 feet and give them the occasional jig or tug. When the school of flounders were thick, you could snare 5 or 6 flounder on a line that way. In any case, my brother could feel that there was resistance on his line, and he started pulling it up. He got the line up and out of the water till he got to the part of the hook, and on the other end of the line was this mass of yellow and white flesh about the size of a loaf of bread. My brother looked over at me. I had no clue what it was, and I called my grandfather's attention over, asking, "Hey Grandpa, what's this?" At that point, the mass of flesh flexed a few times and started climbing up the last 6 feet of the line towards my brother's outstretched hand. It had a sanguine movement and super dangerous looking as it quickly reached his hand. My grandfather, who I never saw move faster than a shuffle, sprung out across the deck with a 12-inch gutting knife and hacked the line so hard the knife was embedded in the railing of the boat. They stood there, staring down as the line and its reaching passenger dropped back into the ocean, and looked up at us and simply said, "We don't want that in the boat with us." I'll be damned to this day if I knew what it was, but I'm certain I didn't want to see what it did should it have reached my brother's arm or got onto the boat. I was fishing a 17-foot Mohawk canoe off the main bridge in Tootsieville, Florida, about 2000. My kids were small. It's teeming with fish in that area, and I headed for a trowel that NASA cut out to build the fuel railroad system out to the launch area. It holds black drum, as well as other tasties. I have a trolling motor on the side of the canoe, and I head for my spot down the shoreline. Over to my left, just as I arrive at the south end of the trowel, I see a pod of manatee in the water, about 75 yards away. I have a little camera stowed away, and decide to get some close-up pictures for the kids. I turn west to the middle of the lagoon area and head over shallow water and grass bed with my trolling motor turned to 5, top speed. I notice it appeared very shallow immediately ahead of me, and I cut the motor down to 0. That's the last thing I remember, before hearing the loudest noise that came from all around me. Water exploded around and under my 75-pound canoe with a 150-pound me in on the back. The front of my canoe went up at over a 45-degree angle, and the rear of my canoe, with me in it, came off the surface of the water some amount, such as my battery came off the floor. In the front of my canoe, all my tackle and such was launched into the air. I remember seeing a single large pinfish arching over the whole mess as I gripped the gunnels. It's not obvious what happened to me for a minute. I was so afraid and so vulnerable and unsure if it would happen again. I reattached things back to my trolling motor and went back to the shoreline where the railroad passed, and got out and tried to piece my equipment back together and my experience. The pod of roughly 21 manatees had come into the lagoon, and, as it turns out, they have a similar danger signal to beavers. They slap the surface of the water. When many of them do it, and it's in 2 feet of water, they're really frightened by my entry into the area. It can almost violate the laws of bowel physics. Trust me, I know. My father was diagnosed with small cell lung cancer in October of 2009, and by April 2010 he was literally on his deathbed at the age of 54. He was more or less comatose, though sometimes he would open his eyes, look at me, and if I asked him if he could hear me, he would just stare and go back into his pseudo-coma. On April 6th, a week before his death, I had a dream that felt, for all intents and purposes, like reality. It was in my parents' backyard at night. The air was still, and I was standing by a fireplace my father had built that previous summer. Then I looked to the right and saw my father more or less in his current physical state, lying on the ground. He looked up at me and sort of telepathically gestured that he couldn't speak to me, nor could he move, both of which were true in real life. Because I was looking at only part of his soul that he had moved onto the other side. He wasn't whole yet, and kept emphasizing and phrasing to me. The dream then jumped to me standing in front of my dad, who was now sitting in his old 1992 Sooo. Again, he gestured to me telepathically that he could get in the car to start, but could not get it to go into first gear, and I wake up. 3 days later, I had a dream my dad was younger, and he was standing, laughing in the pool in his backyard. I walked over to him, and he looked at me and smiled and said, "I've got my voice back. I just need my hair," and pointed to his head, which was still bald. "And then I'll be set," he said. At that moment I wake up. 3 days later, I am more or less in a dream where I'm a third person witnessing and watching my dad, who is about 18 years old in the dream, constantly looking at a wristwatch and crossing multiple intersections on foot in a large city with tall buildings, yet no other people. I watch him do this until he's out of my sight, and the following morning he died. Even after his death, I've had dreams where I've had full-on conversations with him. He's told me of his plans to be travel-wise, with he looking out for us, who he's looking out for, etc. It's probably just a coping mechanism, but I've never experienced anything quite like it. I don't believe in anything remotely religious, but it's been difficult for me to shrug off my dying father telling me in a set of dreams that he wanted to show me the progression of his soul moving from one world to another. I should preface my story by saying that I am a natural skeptic about everything, especially ghost stories. In fact, I don't want to believe ghost stories because they scare the shit out of me, and I couldn't sleep for weeks after seeing Sixth Sense. But I cannot deny what happened to me one night. My wife, now ex-wife, and I went to visit some of her friends who had just bought a house in Chicago. A very typical Chicago-style home bungalow. The plan was that we were going to get dinner and then my wife and I would spend the night, so that we did not have to drive back to our home in the suburbs. Our friends were giving us a tour of their home, when the guy said to me, "Hey, do you want to see something really cool?" and proceeded to lead me into one of the bedrooms. The first thing I noticed was that it was sort of odd that the door had 3 locks on it, all on the outside of the door, so that you could lock someone in the room. I remember this because my wife made a dumb joke about the wife locking her husband in there when he was bad. So we go into the room and he leads me to a closet where there is this half door on the back wall, which, again, has several locks on the outside. He removes the locks and the door and slips into the door. I follow him to discover that this passageway leads to the basement of the house, which was the full size of the house but with no windows at all. I thought it was very odd, to say the least. He was going on about he was planning to turn it into his man cave / wine cellar, and so forth. And all I kept thinking to myself was how I was getting a very uncomfortable vibe. I am not normally someone who feels those types of feelings, but for some reason, I could not wait to get out of there. So we go on to have dinner, have some drinks and so forth, and end up back at their house. They had 2 couches in the front room of the house, by the front door, where we were to sleep. We all said our good nights and went off to bed, and a short while later, I started hearing these noises, which I thought were our friends walking around the house. I figured that they were not yet asleep, and were just milling about, so I tried to go back to sleep, but the noises persisted. Then I started hearing noises of door handles turning, but again, dismissed it as our friends. Then I heard the front door handle, which was no less than 5 feet away from me, turning. I sat up, fully expecting to see our friends, but there was no one there. Then I got concerned that someone was outside trying to get in. So I got up and looked out the door, but didn't see anyone. While I was looking out the front door, I clearly heard the sound of someone running from one room to another behind me. I went over to the master bedroom and peeked in to see our friends sound asleep. That is when I started to freak out a bit. I laid back on the couch and the noises continued. I was scared, but at the same time, not scared. I was just lying there chuckling to myself, thinking, what the hell is going on? Eventually, after a while, I fell asleep. And the next morning, our friends walked into the living room where my wife and I were sleeping, as she was on another couch. And my wife says first thing, "Dude, your house is totally haunted." I was shocked, and soon my wife and I were talking about all the noises we had heard, but our friends did not seem to want to talk about it. Later at breakfast, I brought it up again saying, "Seriously, what's up with the noises?" And our friend's wife turned really white and said, "I don't want to talk about it." And that was it. As you can imagine, we never went back. So, when I was around 18 to 21, I had a friend whose house was from the 1920s. I lived down the street from him, in suburban Wisconsin. I thought I would share some experiences we had in the house. Some good, some bad, all true. The first incident is pertaining to the willow tree. We had gathered for a late barbecue, late that night, as we had been watching movies and discussing the universe. We ended up reading about the Celtic beliefs in the supernatural aspects of the willow tree. There was one in my friend's backyard, so at around 3 a.m. we went outside to ask it questions. At one point, a friend who was standing with us just yelled, "What the hell?" and ran inside. We all followed suit and asked him what happened. Before he said, I asked everyone if they heard anything outside. People nodded, and I asked them to write down what they heard instead of saying it aloud. I unfolded all 4 pieces of paper, and they had all written on them, "Hello, Smithster." You see, the last name of the friend that ran inside was Smith. It was a nickname his grandfather called him, and we had never heard it before. The second incident happened a little later, in the same house. We had a party and it got late. My friend and I asked everyone to leave, and we retired to his room upstairs. We were tired. We had been drinking a bit, but we were not influenced. He laid in his bed, and I took an air mattress on the floor. And after a few minutes he said to me, "Do you hear Joe and John downstairs?" I think, what the hell? Either they need to be quiet or leave. I replied that I heard them saying something about going to get pizza, and I agreed it was annoying, as I was trying to sleep as well. He said he heard the pizza discussion, and after hearing them argue for more than 10 minutes, we had enough. I asked him to call John's phone and tell them to shut up or go home. So my friend calls John's phone, and John answers, and I hear my friend say, "Oh, sorry man," and hangs up. He just turns over in bed, and I ask him what's going on, if they were leaving or what. He says, "I don't want to tell you." I tell him to just spill it, and then he spills and says that they'd been asleep at Joe's house for the last 2 hours. We hear their voices downstairs again discussing shit, and neither of us go down to the kitchen. The next day, they show up with pizza. The final incident happened again in the house. I'm standing in the kitchen with 6 others. My friend's front door opens all by itself and then closes 20 seconds later. His back door to the grill opens and shuts, and then the grill starts up, and we watch it happen. No one talks about it, and I go check the front door, and it's locked. I had a best friend when I was in my early preteens, who lived about 3 miles away from me. We'd often walk or bike to each other's houses, depending on whatever we were planning to do. The hiking route was through a very thickly wooded area, which had a deep ravine right down the middle of it. From my backyard you entered the woods, and when you emerged on the other side, you'd be in his backyard, which was actually a huge set of fields as they were farmers. They were fairly clear trails through the woods, and it was an arduous journey in either direction, which actually made it more fun. It was nice to be off the streets and in the woods. But these woods were weird. Like I said, it was very thickly wooded, and you would have to descend into and back out of a fairly deep ravine, with a stream running through the bottom. The ravine section of the road trip had no trails, and you'd be just roughing it by dead reckoning for that section. Oddly, there was a little copse in the ravine that had a fountain in it, a regular man-made ceramic fountain that you would find in any garden centre, but empty of water, right out there in the middle of nowhere, and it was sort of standing on a base of some rocks. On multiple occasions, most often in deep winter, I'd set out through the woods, bash my way down the ravine and past the fountain, and then up the other side, and then through the last half of the wooded trail. Then I'd walk out of the woods and into my own backyard, right where I'd started. The first time this happened, I called my buddy up on the phone and was like, "Dude, I just hiked all the way to your house and ended up at my house." He sort of wigged out and said, "Dude, you're kidding me. That happened to me last week." So over a period of 2 years, most especially during the winter when there was a lot of snow, we noticed that this happened to us independently, maybe 4 or 5 times. Not every time, but by any means only rarely. So we decided to make several trips together in one day. Once again it was winter, very cold and deeply covered in snow, and the walk was a pain in the ass. The first trip was the house, and sure enough, through the woods, down the ravine and past up the ugly fountain, we would arrive out of the woods and would leave at my house. So on the second trip, as we were already sick of this shit by now, and not really interested in doing it again, because it was a pain in the ass, we decided to take a slightly longer route, around the bowl of the ravine, and by the other side without descending. It took a lot longer, but we ended up at his house, as one would expect. We abandoned the experiment at that point, and just played Atari for the rest of the afternoon, and I stayed overnight. I remember this weird mum made us French toast next morning, and it was delicious. I took the standard trip the next day, but in the valley of the ravine, I purposefully avoided the copse with the fountain, and ended back at my house normally. I haven't seen that guy in 35 years, and I can't help but wonder what he's up to now. This event happened to my younger cousin. It is a bit too long, but worth sharing. My cousin Kim is about 6 years younger than me. She has, since birth, had the ability to see spirits. They appear whole and like normal people, and not a wispy apparition. When Kim was around 5, her family moved into a valley on the eastern side of Oahu, a place known to contain Hawaiians' burial grounds. Kim became the perfect child, going to bed on time, eating her vegetables, and cleaning her room without having to be asked. My aunt said to her, "Kim, why are you such a good girl?" To which Kim replied, "The green man told me to." My aunt figured it was a childhood imaginary friend and let it go. Kim's brother Shane, who was 3 years older than Kim, would often tell his mum that Kim was crazy because she would keep communicating with a Hawaiian spirit that she called the Green Man, because that was the colour of his malo, his loincloth. And if he was going to do an offering in the corner of Kim's room, where they saw the Green Man make a show of respect. They did this, and about 6 months after visiting the Odaisan, my aunt, my grandmother, and Kim were all 4 killed in an accidental car crash, with theirs being in the middle. My aunt was then pregnant with Kim's younger sister at the time. My aunt, my grandmother, and Kim were all in the front seat of the family station wagon without wearing their seatbelts. And when my aunt heard that and the movement of the tires in the front bench, the Odaisan advised the family that the spirit was benevolent, as if he was going to do something evil, it would have already happened. The Odaisan instructed the family to put a bottle of gin as an offering in the corner of Kim's room, where she saw the Green Man to show respect. They did this, and about 6 months after visiting, my aunt, my grandmother, and Kim were in a 4-car accident, their car being in the middle. My aunt was then pregnant with Kim's younger sister at the time, and my aunt, my grandmother, and Kim's tires were screeching. She looked back into her rearview mirror and saw a young Hawaiian man sitting in the back seat smiling. At the moment of impact, the front bench seat reclined so that when the cars hit, they were in prone position. The station wagon was totaled, smashed like an aluminium can. Yet, no one, including the baby, was injured. My aunt knew the junk operator, and she asked him about the seats, claiming it must have just broken on impact. The operator checked and told her the seat worked fine, and that the lever was tripped. My aunt visited the Odaisan and told her what happened. The Odaisan explained that the Green Man was Kim's guardian angel, and that he had performed a good deed before he could be released from the spirit world. Kim never saw the Green Man after the accident 30 years later, but we still talk about it, and is one of our creepy experiences of the paranormal. I was 12 and staying at school in one of the largest dorm rooms. There were 8 of us in there. It was a Wednesday night, and a usual one at that. We had all slept in that room for almost a year. It was our allocated room for the school year. The school was actually a really old house that had been converted. Obviously, we were in the oldest part of the house, and our dorm was next to a music room with a piano in it. The only way to get to that room was to go through our room, so that's why we were so on edge when it happened. Like I said, it was a normal Wednesday night. We all messed until about midnight after being put to bed at 9 p.m. but we were all asleep soon after that. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that I was awoken by the guy below me on our bunk bed, who was talking rather quickly in a harsh whisper to one or two of the other guys. As I was listening to him for a second, I realized that he was talking about the noise that he could hear from the music room. It was the piano. It was being played at 2 a.m. I jumped and yelled. It freaked me out. Not in a scared way, but a sort of, I'm creeped out because someone is playing the piano in the middle of the night, and I don't understand as I'm only 12 kind of way. So now we're all awake, listening to the piano and talking about it, all wanting to know who was playing. So we all got out of bed and approached the door. It was so clear it was the piano at this point. We were more scared of being told off by the master that would be playing it because we were out of bed at such a late hour. But we as a group decided we needed to know who it was. So we very slowly pushed the door open, but the light was off. So someone flicked the switch quickly and pushed the door open so that we could confront whoever was playing. No one. The piano wasn't being played by anyone. The cover wasn't even open. What the actual shit? We ran and woke the matron, screaming what had happened. She didn't believe us, so we all eventually got detention and were sent back to bed. I can safely say that none of us slept well in that room for the rest of the year. It was all we could talk about and think about. Nothing was ever proved, but there were other weird things that happened to other kids during my school years there. A teacher who was a friend of my mother's left the school because of the eerie sounds that she kept hearing and the glimpses of figures, but I don't know about all of that. What I do know is that I was really freaked out, and I can't explain what it was. Just for those of you who may be wondering, this piano was incredibly old, but was still kept in tune by the school. It wasn't a self-playing piano. We checked the inside. So there's absolutely nothing that could have done that back in the day. From time to time, the sounds still haunt my dreams. This happened about 6 years ago or so, when I was in high school, near the end of the fall, before Christmas break, when there are a lot of projects due at the school, and we had an art night for students, with art, music and drama classes that needed extra time to prepare for their big projects. It was half intense study time and half everyone just spending time together talking or goofing off. It would last from 7 till about 1 a.m. or 2 p.m, depending on how tired the teachers got. By this time, it was about midnight, and most people were either done with their work or given up for the night, so a lot of people were just talking or working on their own thing. A couple of the photography students were just taking pictures for fun and developing the film, as they used the film for class. Most of these photos were your typical stupid high school photos of girls making stupid faces at the camera that they would of course put into the yearbook because they were also in charge of that. Suddenly, there are two very loud sharp screams from the darkroom, and two girls are coming out babbling nonsense and crying. We all try to figure out what is happening, and the teacher comes in to calm them down as well. They explained that they were developing photos, and one of them had a ghost in it. Of course, we're all curious, so we go into the darkroom to check it out. The teacher pulls the photo out of the chemicals and sees a picture of them that they had taken while running around in the old building, as it was called. It was just an old stone building with a couple of classrooms and a big storage basement, and is also the oldest part of the building in use. The two girls are leaning against the banister to the second floor. Behind them, seemingly out of nothing, is a very clear other girl's face with her mouth open, staring at the camera, fading to the rough shape of a body. To be honest, the rest of us thought it was awesome. We were trying to figure out what had happened. It didn't look like the girl had taken the picture. There weren't any reflective surfaces. The girls claimed they didn't do it on purpose to freak people out. We examined the film, and you could still sort of see the face, so they developed another one just to see again, and it was exactly the same. One picture the art teacher locked in his office to show off on Monday. The other was passed around the rest of the night, and eventually returned to the girls. Come Monday, things got even more strange. The girls were freaking out again, and showed the art teacher their copy of the photo. The face was gone. Again suspecting foul play, he got the photo from his office, and was shocked to say that the face was also absent from that photo. Everyone was in uproar at this point, with how crazy creepy the whole thing was. They decided to develop yet another photo to see what happened. But when it came out, nothing. No face, not a trace of it, nada. The art teacher confirmed it was still the original film, because the rest of the photographs were on it, and was being befuddled by the whole ordeal. He kept teasing the girls about it, and they are since terrified of that building. I even had my 5th year of high school reunion this September, and one of the two girls was there. We spoke about it. She says she still gets uneasy seeing that building when she drives by. Not that she's ever really back in town. I wish I had some sort of story about a girl who died in the building, or gruesome murders, but there hasn't been a murder in this town in over 70 years. Who knows what happened? All I can say is, having seen the photo myself, it did not look like a smudge or a bizarre photo effect. It was definitely a human face, of a girl I did not recognize. My bet is they faked it with some sort of unique effect, though I normally wouldn't consider them nearly as devious or as motivated to do something that elaborate. Still, nevertheless, it's still quite a creepy story. Ever since I started working in an international school here in my country, I've been seeing things that I should not see. I am really afraid of the dark, as well as being alone. So being able to see those little things creep me out. But after a few times, it just became a usual occurrence in my life. This story happened in mid-February, around 2014. In my school, we usually have 2 to 5 students per class. My classroom for that day was quite spacious for us, and on the left were the doors and narrow windows. That time, I only had 2 naughty students. They were annoying each other, so while I'm writing on the whiteboard, I'm staring at their reflections too. At first, I was staring straight at them, and then, suddenly, something caught my eye. Outside the window, a boy of around 6 to 8 years old passes. I only saw his head, but wasn't able to see his facial features properly. I stared at him because I thought that he was the son of one of my co-faculty, and suddenly he disappeared before reaching the door. I immediately excused myself from the class and went out to check if I was just imagining that the boy disappeared. I looked around the corner, but there's no one in sight. Then it hit me that there's only one class in the area except mine. To ask if they saw a boy running around and to check if someone was around that height. When I arrived there, they said that no one had come since the bell rang, and that all the people in their class are the tallest in our school. I shrugged it off and went back to my class to resume my lesson. After that, I went to my second class. My second classroom is located on the 3rd floor of the main building, which is used as the girls' dormitory. It's the only room there that is used as a classroom, so we're alone in the whole floor. Whoever comes to the 3rd floor can feel a very heavy and suffocating feeling. They don't turn on the lights in the area, and there are minimal windows, which makes it scarier. There's a dorm room that usually attracts my attention. I don't know why, but every time I pass there I feel like someone is sitting on the bed and asking for my attention. Anyway, my class is on the complete opposite side of the corridor. My classroom is very spacious and bright due to the number of windows there, and I have 6 students. Upon entering the classroom, I decided to forget what had happened in my other class, and after finishing my lesson, we had a very fun conversation. Suddenly, they became quiet, and that's when I heard a small child singing. It sounded like a girl, and I asked my students if they heard it, but everyone said they didn't. Again, curiosity got the best of me, so I went out to check, but all I saw was the darkness of the hallway. I also checked outside the windows, but there really was no one. After that day, I promised myself I would try not to go back to that classroom. Even up to this day, if I still see kids running around in other classrooms, or I find myself staring into a certain spot, there'll always be nothing there. I should preface this by saying it was by far the scariest experience of my life, and it's bringing tears to my eyes just remembering it. Basically, on the hill above the city I live, there are a string of rather large defensive forts. My grandfather was the curator and led tour guides of one of these forts. They date back to Napoleonic times, when the British were afraid of a French attack on the city, because of its importance to the supplies of the Navy. They're not incredibly creepy places. Maybe that's because I'd spend every weekend roaming the tunnels and doing errands there. But this one event left me shocked and incapable of going back down there alone, even 12 years later. As I mentioned, under the fort are a network of tunnels that descend in places up to 100 feet below the chalk. Some of them are to access the defensive trenches that form the fort's outer boundaries. Some of them contain gun emplacements, and all of them are gently sloping, hewn from rough chalk and dimly lit by the only kind of lights that work so far underground. Those dim mining ones that rely on the weakest electrical current. All of the tunnels were familiar to me, and they could all be accessed from the radial hub that was right in the depths of the fort, except for one. I had always been forbidden to walk down it. The tunnel was of a rougher construction than the rest, unlit and never used. Other than that, from the top end it was fairly unassuming, just something I was never allowed to see. That was until I pestered my grandfather so much that he decided to show me. He grabbed a flashlight, and we started walking down the tunnel. I immediately regretted my decision. I wish I had photographs of it, but the smooth chalk walls I was used to in the other tunnels were replaced by this jagged texture that threatened to draw blood if you scraped them with an unlucky limb. My grandfather, curiously, was aiming the torch beam at the left wall of the tunnel, searching for something. He found it, perhaps halfway down. There, inscribed in the chalk, was a rough cross and a date that was nigh illegible. "This is why you're not supposed to come down here," he said. "The tunnel was supposed to be condemned. Someone was crushed right here." A chill ran through me, and I asked to leave. My grandfather chuckled and carried on, saying that there was nothing to worry about. I started to get a bad feeling from then on, as if someone was following us. Eventually, we reached the bottom. A fairly regular gun replacement met us. Then we turned to leave. The nature of the tunnels meant that you could see all the way up to the other end, where the door-shaped piece of light meant the security of the radial hub. What me and my grandfather saw chills my bones, and like I said, means I can't go down there anymore. We were 100% the only people in there at the time. We were sure of it. It was out of hours, and my grandfather always locked the main gate behind us whenever we entered the tunnel system, in order to stop people from trespassing and stealing the cannons or old munitions. I swear to you, good listeners, we saw the silhouette of a man slowly walk across the top of the tunnel, turn to face down at us, and then carry on. My grandfather is a brave man, but he looked visibly aggrieved. What was worse is we knew we had to run up the tunnel to get out, or we would be stuck in a 100-foot trench in the middle of winter. We had to pass the cross of that crushed tunnel worker, and we made it back. We obviously made it out alive, but when someone tells me they don't believe in ghosts, I tell them this story, and it brings a tear to my eye every time I tell someone about it. This happened in college, conveniently right near Halloween. My friends at the time were quite diverse in our religious beliefs, and it being All Hallows Eve, my Wicca friend wanted to show us all his beliefs. I enjoy the paranormal, and I always have, and as a man of science, I enjoy trying to explain the explainable. Mostly, I enjoy the psychology of it, watching our brains trying to piece together things they want to believe. The subconscious grasping at fragments of reality resulting in psychosomatic hallucinations. He said he wanted to try and summon something, and he said to trust him. And trying to remain skeptical, we indulged in his request. He lit candles and turned off the lights as we formed a circle around the candles. We sat down and held hands, as my friend bowed his head and began humming. He kept humming his as we closed our eyes, and suddenly an image of a cottage entered into my head. It was so surreal and clear. I could feel myself there. It was a calm grass field, and I was just standing at the forest edge when I slowly walked up the path to the cottage. It had 2 floors, and it was a natural wooden brown. I looked over at the window near the door and shattered. And then my girlfriend at the time screamed. She got up and ran out of the room, and another one of my friends jolted back and started yelling, "Oh God, what did you see?" He then starts frantically talking about how he saw himself as a werewolf, and then he started talking about the details that he was in a field. He ran towards a house. It was what I saw. Everything. It wasn't just some vague details, but everything from the fields to the colours. Everything. I asked about the windows because I remember one was broken, and he said he saw himself jumping through it. We stared at each other and knew we saw the same thing. We heard my girlfriend scream again, and we ran out of the room to check in on her. She was cowering in a corner crying. She's a hysteric and won't stop crying about her children. She doesn't even have children. She's in tears out of what happened. And when she says the dogs got them, that they attacked them, and started talking about all the blood, we stood there in silence, mouths agape, regarding what we had just heard. I am a fairly avid camper and have a couple of stories to share. We went on a 5-day gold panning trip with a couple of buddies of mine. We drove 6 hours down using logging roads, and we were talking totally overgrown roads with trees having been removed from the road to pass. We saw not one human the entire time we were out there, except for our 3rd night at 3 a.m. We were sitting around the fire drinking some beers, squatting at bugs and shooting the shit, when I hear something. I look over and notice some lights in the trees. What the? It's a truck, driving up the logging road that we had cleared ourselves to get there. At 3 a.m. The truck gets up to where we were, pulls into where we made our small camp, and sits there for about 10 seconds, while we all kind of stare in shock at one another. I get up and start walking towards the truck to say hello, and ask what the heck he was doing out there at 3 a.m. on abandoned logging roads, when the truck just backs up, turns around and drives off. The guy just drove 6 hours down logging roads through the night, sees us and leaves without saying a word? We're all just sitting there going, what the hell? We all figured this guy was driving down the road, getting out and coming back to kill us in our sleep. Next morning, we head down the road and nothing. They didn't set up camp or anything. Just left. We figured we were likely camping out near a grow-up for one of the gangs, and they were likely coming out to check who had come out to their spot, or they were there to pick the crop in the middle of the night. I'm grateful they left quickly, but I know that if certain things were true, that could have ended very differently. On another occasion, we were driving down a bunch of logging roads at 4 a.m. I know, we love nighttime. Looking for a campsite we had driven past. We took a wrong turn and drove right into a drug operation, crashing out the crop. We turn a corner and blam, floodlights, and 15 guys are staring at us in the middle of the forest down logging roads. We sort of turned around and got the hell out of there. The third story. One time I was out hiking in the backwoods with a buddy of mine, way out with nobody in sight. In the evening, I start to gather some wood for a campfire, and I pulled this stick out of the trees. This stick is maybe 5 foot long and 3 feet wide, and it looks like a nice walking stick, straight and mostly smooth. Then I noticed that the end of it is really smooth, like it's been whittled by someone. Then I'm thinking, oh wow, what are the odds of that? It is a real walking stick. Someone has carved a smooth handle on one end. Nope, it's not a handle, it's a penis. Someone had carved the end of this stick into a penis. Someone was definitely doing something dirty in the forest. This wasn't some crude carving. This was a work. Like the person put hours into carving this, and was very good at carving. This was a 6-inch dong, carved with love and feeling, right down to it having bulging veins and a very fine bulbous. What the hell? So I took the dick stick back to camp and threatened to poke my buddy with it, yelling that the forest was going to give him tree AIDS. Ah, good times. Bonus story. Just to end things on a slightly lighter note. I woke up one morning at 5 AM, tired as shit. I put on my uniform, checked my gear, kissed my sleeping wife, and slowly walked to my patrol car parked in front of my apartment building. Probably looking like a stereotypical zombie in a police uniform that you might see on TV or in a video game. I started my normal routine. I got in the car, turned on the radar, checked on duty, and started playing music from the best album of all time, The Elder Scrolls V. Now for my 15-minute commute to work. My vehicle was getting low on gas, so I stopped at my favourite gas station to fill up, and went inside for my daily breakfast burrito. I went in, put my sausage, egg and cheese burrito in a paper tray, and grabbed all the needed hot sauces. I then grabbed a cup and filled it with water, just as I do at the beginning of every shift. After this, still in zombie mode, I went back to my patrol vehicle with the goodies and continued on my way. About noon, I get a call from my sergeant, who simply said, "I need to speak with you at the department." Oblivious as to why he would need to talk to me, I began heading to the police department. Millions of thoughts rushed through my head, all wondering what he could want to discuss with me. Upon my arrival, I was directed to my lieutenant's office. When I walked in, I heard a stern close the door. At this point I knew it wasn't good. I sat down disturbed as hell, being stared down by my corporal, sergeant and lieutenant. After a preface from my sergeant, he says, "Tell me everything that happened this morning, especially at the gas station." I didn't say anything, just sat there and thought about it again. Ah, shit. I forgot to pay for my burrito. Then I just heard, guess what? That's theft. After a come to Jesus moment with my superior, I left, went straight to the gas station and paid for my burrito. They didn't want to press charges. Although nothing really came of this incident, the shitty part is that I can't go back and fix what that looked like to the other customers. They all saw what looked like an entitled cop not paying for a burrito. On a lighter note, now the officers have a nickname for me, the Burrito Burglar, and jokingly ask for tips on how to steal stuff when I see them. When my aunt was in high school, she was a knockout. She was very popular, homecoming queen, was in beauty pageants, and is a very attractive young woman. She got hit on constantly, and had older men making inappropriate comments on the regular. One day, standing in line at the grocery store with her mum, the man in the line behind them started talking to her and asking her questions. My grandmother was checking out, and not really paying attention to her 16-year-old daughter, assuming she could take care of herself in a crowded grocery store in the middle of the day. Anyway, he starts asking her how old she is, and is that her mum, and what they're making for dinner tonight. Does she have any sisters as pretty as her? The usual cheap fare. Eventually my grandmother notices him talking to her, and tells him they have to leave now and to have a nice day. Just as my aunt and grandmother are loading the groceries into the car, the man walks up to their car and tells my grandmother that my aunt should be a model, and that she should keep an eye on her, because boys that age only want one thing. My grandmother told my aunt to get into the car, and then told the man if he spoke to them again, she would be calling the security guard over. He angrily walked away, mumbling about how he didn't mean any harm, glaring at my aunt, who was sitting in the car the whole time. They drove home and didn't think anything of it. That encounter was weird, but not nearly as bad as what happened later. I should mention at this point that my grandmother lived with my 3 aunts, just the 4 of them, in a 4-bedroom house. After going to bed that night, my aunt woke up and felt a cold breeze coming in through her window. She didn't remember opening her window before bed, and thought she would get up to close it. Then she felt something move on her bed. She didn't move because she was certain it was a hand. She felt someone reaching under her covers and touching her. The way her room was situated, the person was laying on the floor, beneath her bed and the bedroom door. If she were to run, she would have to get past the person first. She lay in bed for a minute, terrified, trying to think of what to do. Then she heard him talking to himself and breathing heavily, as he tried to touch her underneath her clothes. She's fairly sure she knew he was masturbating as he touched her, because she could hear something that sounded wet. Overtaken by fear and adrenaline, she screamed and jumped out of bed, hurling herself over the mystery intruder and into the hallway. My grandmother woke up and came running into the hall, and my aunt told her what happened. They checked the bedroom. The intruder had left out the window. Also, my aunt's bedroom was on the 2nd floor. The intruder must have been in such a hurry to get away that he left his ladder behind, along with Polaroids of my aunt that he had been taking at the grocery store, at her house, and in her backyard. All the photos were on the floor around her bed, where the man had been laying. My grandmother called her neighbor, who came over with a shotgun to sit on their porch all night. The guy was never caught, but thankfully, my aunt never saw him again, and they got a free ladder. When I was living at home with my mum and sister, I was home alone a lot during the day due to illness. My sister is a pretty sociable person, so it wasn't unusual for her to head to a friend's house straight from college some days. So there wasn't a set time that she would be home. My mom, on the other hand, would roll up around 6 p.m. every day. It must have been about 4 on a weekday. as sometimes my sister would finish college early and would come home between 1 and 4 on these occasions. And I was gaming a little after finishing some housework. All of a sudden, from downstairs, I heard my sister shout my name. We're both pretty lazy, so this wasn't unusual. What struck me as odd was that the dog emitted a low growl. I gave him a little belly rub and put it down to her shouting, rousing him from his nap. It was strange, as I hadn't heard the front door being opened nor being closed. But I shrugged it off as me being too immersed in my game and not noticing. I shouted back, "What?" but no response came. 2 minutes later, I heard her shout my name again, louder this time. Now my dog started barking, royally pissed off. I again responded, "Yeah?" but received no reply. With a sigh, I walked to my bedroom door and shouted down the stairs, "Hey, what's up?" But there was no reply. Laziness and defiance prevailed, and instead of going downstairs to see what it was that she wanted, I decided to call her phone. She answered after a few short rings, and I asked her what it was that she required. Confused, she said she hadn't tried to text or call me, and I told her that she'd been shouting my name from downstairs, and I wanted to know what she wanted. She then informed me that she was still at college. I called my mum, and she was still at work. I cautiously went downstairs to check the house, but there was nobody there. My mum and sister's dogs, though, were sitting in the kitchen, cowering in the corner. I went straight back to my room and stayed there until my family got home, thoroughly creeped out. My fiance and I used to live in a pretty old building. It was a super old apartment building, and it just had those vibes, you know? It was just creepy all around. The apartment was tiny, and all the people that lived in it were very strange. There isn't much setup to the story besides that. We had a few other tales, but this one takes the cake. We always sleep with our bedroom door closed, no matter what. It was a normal weeknight, and we were getting ready for bed. We got super cozy and left the door open so the air would flow better, even though it was a tiny space with a window unit in both rooms. I felt like I woke up, and shortly after realized I was having somewhat of a lucid dream. I start looking around the room, and I see something as I am scanning. The ceiling was recessed a little higher in the excuse for a hallway we had that was right outside our bedroom. It looked like a black figure was hanging from the top right corner in the hallway, just suspended and completely black. It freaked me out a little, so I blinked, and when I did, the figure was standing next to my bed. It looked like the silhouette of a woman, and she was looking at my fiancé that was next to me. I started to freak out, and the figure touched my fiance's shoulder, and I could see her life leave her. She went visibly limp. I started wiggling out and reached to grab the figure. And I grabbed what I can only imagine was its boob, and squeezed as hard as I could. And I woke up, yelling. I checked to see if my fiancée was still alive, and she was. I was so relieved, and when she woke up to ask me what was wrong, I told her about the dream. She said she had a dream too, and it felt weird and unnatural, like something was watching her in her sleep. We didn't get back to sleep that night, and left that place as soon as we possibly could. 'Twas quite the fright. My mother's house has a back door that goes directly from the porch into the kitchen. The door has a large glass window in it that is uncovered. One day, I was going over to her house, and when I pulled up in the back, I very clearly saw a white-haired, elderly lady standing in the window of that door, smiling. I assumed she was someone visiting my mother, but I looked down to grab my purse and keys, and when I looked back up, she was gone. But I didn't think anything of it. I got out of the car and walked to the back door, looking in the front driveway as I went to see if there was an unfamiliar car there, but it was empty. When I walked inside, my mother came from the front of the house back to the kitchen, and I asked her who was visiting. She looked at me like I was crazy and said that there was no one there, but I protested. I know what I saw. I even remembered the color of her blouse. That's not all though. I was home alone for a weekend a few years ago. After school one day, I was driving home, and when I passed in front of my house, I thought I saw some old lady in white clothes in my sister's room, looking through the window. Now at the time, I didn't draw a parallel between these two events. I thought it was stupid, so I went into the room to check out what it actually was, but I couldn't find anything. I pretty much forgot all about it until later that night, when I got called from a very panicked and scared neighbor, who let me know that there was an old lady pacing back and forth in my sister's room. He said he wasn't concerned at first, but after seeing it happen non-stop for nearly an hour and a half, he started to wonder. Obviously, I went back to check and found nothing. I still have no idea what it was, and fortunately, have never seen anything like it since. I just wish my mum would believe me. When I was about 5 or 6, we were living in a rented house that seemed normal enough, but strange things started to happen shortly after we moved in. My older brother liked doing these huge 500-piece puzzles, and he would put them together on the floor of our bedroom, and they started getting messed up during the night. Everyone naturally assumed it was me, but it wasn't. Not long after that began, I started having really bad nightmares about a woman in her early 20s. She was in a white cotton nightgown with violet flowers on it. She had long, wavy, tangled black hair and was swaying from the ceiling light, and she would stare at me with a look of pure hatred. It got so bad that my parents took me to a therapist who said I was having night terrors. About a month after the night terrors started, we moved to another house suddenly. My parents claimed it was because they found a house much closer to my dad's work. And just like that, the night terrors stopped and my brother's puzzles were being left intact. It wasn't until 15 years later, visiting the family, that I found out the truth. My mother was talking to one of our neighbors about my night terrors, and she said that another family with a little girl rented the place a few years before us, and she had the exact same nightmares, right down to the nightgown with the pretty purple flowers. The neighbor also mentioned that no one seemed to stay in that house for more than a year. My mum thought it was too much of a coincidence, so she started asking around and found out from an older couple in the neighborhood that a young woman had killed herself in the house in the early 60s, and my experience took place in the mid-80s. My mother went to the library and looked through information and found the news articles. It turned out that the girl, who was in her early 20s, had mental health issues and was being cared for by her parents, and had gone into that room in the middle of the night and had hung herself by the ceiling light. I never got to see the picture they had of the girl in the paper, but my mum said she had long, wavy black hair. I'll never forget her burning eyes.